Hello and welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard, and I wanted to remind you you can follow Eschatology Matters and the content that we have coming out via YouTube, where we have our traditional YouTube channel, but you can also check out Eschatology Matters on podcast platforms. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever podcasting platform is your preference of choice. You can also find Eschatology Matters on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the typical social media accounts, but I also want to encourage you to check out our website, eschatologymatters.org, where we are consistently uploading content and have various means of contacting you and getting information out that way. I also want to make sure to recommend that you check out our tickets that are on sale for our September conference. That conference will be in September, on September 8th and 9th, and that'll be in Topeka, Indiana. You can hear different eschatological themes, such as we're covering the kingdom of God, the theme of resurrection, the theme of new creation, final judgment, and yours truly will be speaking on the theme of all authority. So I encourage you, if you did not come last year, or perhaps if you're new to this channel, check out that conference, and if you're in the area, we'd love to see you and connect with you there. All right, well, I'm joined today, again, this will be the second visit to Eschatology Matters with Dr. Daniel Hummel. Daniel, welcome, and thanks for coming back and chatting with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Daniel, go ahead and give just a reintroduction, if you would. I know I was going to mention that you're out of the upper house there at UW-Madison, but just for those that had not seen maybe our first chat, which was several months back as we were discussing, but just give a brief bio, if you would.
Yeah, I grew up in the evangelical world, was a missionary kid. Relevant to this conversation, I grew up in the dispensational world. Ended up going to Colorado State University for my undergrad, and then I came here where I am now, Madison, Wisconsin. I went to UW-Madison for a PhD in American religious history, and I focused particularly for that PhD on U.S. evangelical views of Israel and the Christian Zionist movement. Pretty hot topic a few years ago in particular. A lot of books came out on that. And so I've written this second book called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. It's related, but different territory. Anyway, that's my sort of intellectual trajectory. The last thing I'll say is I continue to be a practicing evangelical Christian. I go to an evangelical free church here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm no longer in the dispensationalist world, but I'm also have a lot of family who are, and I'm on good terms with them. So I enjoy all types of theological backgrounds and people, but I'm writing as a historian outside of that movement.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that was so unique about your book, and the full title, because the full title monumental. It's The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism: How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. And it just released, by the way. That was it Star Wars Day, May 4th?
That's right. Yeah, May 4th.
Right. There you go. Because I remember us talking about that on the first interview. But yeah, that was one of the things that made this work. It seemed to be a bit unique, was instead of maybe a theological treatise, it was primarily from a historical outlook. Obviously, theology is adjacent. But yeah, historical outlook on that. I want to talk about the reception of the book, Daniel, because this is kind of a follow-up chat for you and I. We talked about some of the kind of bigger issues behind the book when we were on the front end. We walked through dispensationalism. I'd recommend anybody that wants to check that out. That was one of our early interviews. But I know there's been some controversy, not the least of which was your misapplication of Avengers Endgame versus Avengers Infinity War on Twitter. And I just want to, if you want to set the record straight with that, Daniel, I just wanted to provide that opportunity for you, brother.
Oh, well, it is one of my more public embarrassments. Yes, I was talking about the snap, which is like the main plot device in those two movies.
There you go.
And yes, I misattributed where the scene I was referencing happens. So I'm actually sort of getting confused now thinking about it. I think Endgame is the last movie. Is that right? Do you know, Josh?
I'm not going to lie. I had to Google it when I saw you make that correction online. I couldn't.
Yeah, it's the first scene of the last movie. Even though the snap happens at the end of the first movie. So that was all an attempt to, leverage pop culture to talk about my own little academic world, but that the snap in the Avengers movies has a strong resemblance to the rapture. So this any moment sudden disappearance. In the movies, it's half of all humanity. In the doctrine of the rapture, it's all true believers. But it reminded me of growing up in a family in a church community that believed in the any moment rapture, and when you'd come home, and you were like the only person at home, and if no one was around, there might be just this like sort of flash of concern in the back of your mind that did the rapture happen, and am I left behind? And I know that some people, growing up in that world and then leaving it, have called that, rapture anxiety, or something where different things can sort of spark that off. But I got that feeling when I was watching the Avengers movies, and sort of suddenly, because I wasn't really expecting it. But it's one of those little artifacts for, I think, a lot of people that grow up in that world.
Right. No, and I think hopefully we can touch on this a little later. I know we wanted to talk through kind of some of those phases of the book that you work through, and how kind of the dispensational thought. And one of the things, obviously you're approaching this very, very I don't know, gently, respectfully, right? Like, yeah, you're not targeting dispensationalism, but you are talking about how its thought processes seem to have kind of seeped into the cultural zeitgeist, the kind of thought patterns of our country. So I do want to touch on that. But what's been the reception on this this book been like, Daniel? I know you've been on several podcasts, several different interviews. You've been walking through it. Obviously, the book is now released, but what's been the initial reception to it? How's that gone?
Overall, it's been very well. One word is fun. It's been really fun to engage with people all across the sort of theological spectrum on the book. It's a little too early for me to know sort of what the official critical reception is. There aren't a bunch of published reviews yet, but I would say I've had a lot of contact through the podcasts I've done, and through just emailing people. People enjoy sort of sending personal messages. Overall, I've been really heartened by it. I don't want to sort of describe my own book in any glowing terms, but people seem to have connected with it. I would say particularly people who have some relationship to dispensationalism have found different parts of the book helpful in connecting dots in names or institutions or Bible, sort of interpretations of the Bible that they grew up in. I have talked to a number of people who I guess you'd call dispensationalists, or people who still, people don't always identify by their theological school of thought, but people who are still sympathetic to it. And I would say there's definite critiques. I get friendly critiques, things I didn't cover that they wished I would have covered. But I've also sort of heard that from those same people, that they do identify with the sort of fall language in the title, The Rise and Fall, in the sense that a lot of them do identify with the sense that they feel like they're on the margins of conversations now in the academic world, right. Even as so much pop culture, as we just talked about, has sort of these different vestiges of premillennial dispensationalism in them. That could maybe lead an outsider to assume that it's much more popular among scholars and seminarians than it actually is. But those have been some really interesting emails back and forth. You also get really weird emails as well, and I won't out the person, but I did have someone email me claiming that they had shared a bunk bed with Hal Lindsey in the summer of 1969, which would be right when he was writing The Late Great Planet Earth, and so this would have been on the campus of UCLA. So I'm following up with him because I'm a little incredulous about if this person actually did share a bunk bed with Hal Lindsey. But if he did, I want to hear the stories. So anyway, you get weird people coming out of the woodwork when you publish something as well.
That's a heck of a lead in. I shared a bunk bed with Hal Lindsey. I wanted to push in, Daniel, because when we spoke last, you had defined dispensationalism. You talked about it as one of evangelicalism's most resilient and contentious popular theologies. So I remember when we first chatted, and I was considering kind of that topic of your book, and like you said, a lot of these things, you're going to see book reviews coming out down the road, and how it's received in academic and in popular circles. But are there any specific areas, it being such a broad-reaching way of looking at Scripture, and also a way of looking at life? Obviously this impacts eschatology, but also many other ways you view the church, the family, everything else, the nation. Are there any specific areas that you've identified that maybe like, oh, you didn't think that was going to be quite so contentious, or you know what I mean? Like any sort of areas that have kind of come to the surface during this conversation in the initial weeks and months after the book?
Yeah, one that comes to mind is I don't know if it's an area of contention, but it's sort of something I hope gets clearer as I talk about the book more. But a lot of people within the Christian world or not really think of dispensationalism as the rapture. We've already talked about it here. And as you just said, it's a much bigger system of thinking than just the sort of one teaching or even a set of teachings about the end times. It's a whole it's a whole system of theology. It's I talk about the founder or the sort of original thinker for a lot of this stuff is John Nelson Darby in the 19th century, and I try to describe him as someone who really came to all of his ideas through ecclesiology and through rethinking what the church is, that led him to a new way of thinking about eschatology that ultimately was undergirded by a new type of biblical hermeneutic. So there's a sort of whole theological world that I wanted to explore in the book, and the subtitle does sort of set you up to be thinking about the end times more than anything else. But
Right.
I've been disappointed with a few sort of people who've really tried to reduce it to talking about the rapture, and there's a lot of reason for that. But I hope as people continue to talk about dispensationalism, they get a sense of the scope of the thinking that's gone into it, and if you're not in that world, the points of contention between dispensationalists and other types of theologians extend far more than just when does the rapture happen, or
Right.
what is the mark of the beast, or something like that. It's about how you read your Bible. It's about how you think about the role of the church in the world, in history, and it's ultimately about what you think we're called to do as Christians in this world. So it's something that I hope comes through in the book, but you're pushing up against a lot of that pop dispensationalist sort of eschatology, and the lack of familiarity that a lot of people have with the rest of the dispensationalist system.
Right. Yeah, and the system, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but looking at it's the water in which the fish swims, essentially, right? So you look at the rapture, you look at the mark of the beast, those are kind of the hot button issues, and yet you have to step back then and say, okay, what are the ways of, like you said, reading the Bible even and approaching Scripture, and how do I put together Old and New Testament? Who are the people of God? Large structures that a book like this is encouraging to me, because even if somebody, like, let's say they're not dispensational and they remain not dispensational, or vice versa, they're dispensational and they remain dispensational, this will at least give, I think, a little bit of more of a broad view, historical progression that they can kind of fit themselves within a theological stream.
That's the hope.
Yeah. So I want to get into some of the national stuff, Daniel, and talk about some of the kind of big picture stuff. But you brought up something when we were talking beforehand that I'd like to push in on just a little bit, because one of the things we've talked with, obviously, many people have changed their eschatology over the years. Many people have changed maybe even those broad overarching systems, whether it's covenant theology, dispensationalism, ways of reading Scripture. But a lot of people have examined those things and worked through them, and then oftentimes come to different conclusions on those issues. And a lot of the guys we've talked to on our podcast here at Eschatology Matters have mentioned either having changed their eschatology specifically, or having changed their overarching theology broadly, that then led to eschatology and convictions about those type of things. But I'm thinking of the health, or maybe the helpfulness of something like your book when it comes to those sort of things. So I don't want to use the word deconstructing necessarily, because that brings a lot of baggage. And probably rightly so. But if we were to think of people examining their belief systems and trying to biblically work through those things, how might your book or your approach maybe help them work through some of those biblical systems and maybe come to more biblical, hopefully, conclusions on the other side?
Yeah, well, one way would be, I think, what a historian can do, what a historian can add to the conversation, is really trying to let all of us know that we are entering our own sort of personal stories, are entering much bigger stories about the church and Christian thought that we don't really have control over necessarily. We have to sort of adapt and respond once we realize we're part of these bigger stories. And so I think for a lot of people that grew up in the 50s, 60s, even in the 70s, dispensationalism was by far the most prevalent sort of popular eschatology out there, and many people grew up in that world, not knowing that there was really much else out there, either historically, or there were obviously other types of Christians existing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as well. And so one of the sort of ways that a lot of people narrate their sort of deconstruction or deconversion out of that system is by, usually in their late teens, 20s, 30s, realizing that there's a lot more out there, and also then not having the tools within the system they grew up in to really respond to that. And I think that part of that's just growing up and learning that there's much more complicated things out there than what you grew up with. But it's also instructive that these theological systems, the people who are really invested in them, tend to try to really, in the sort of full use of the term, indoctrinate them to the next generation. And
Mm.
sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And a lot of why it works or why it doesn't isn't necessarily up to the merits of the system. It's up to the broader society, the way institutions rise and fall, the way books are published or not published, and then a bunch of things that are sort of unique to each person's life. And so for me, when I think about my own story along those sort of macro forces, I'm very humbled. I'm very thankful to the sovereignty of God for the people he's put in my life and the things he's allowed me to read and think through. And I think each of us can sort of have that humility when we're thinking about our own stories.
Right. And when I think about a historical progression like your book is trying to do, because I know for a lot of people, they're just thinking, or maybe they're not, but I would think a lot of people are thinking, just give me the theology, give me some proof text to work through, give me a biblical framework for this. I think one of the things about a historical approach that might be helpful, and again, I'm uncomfortable with the language of deconversion. Oftentimes I find that that's paired, and not the way you're using it, but you understand what I mean. Like a lot of people pair that with an unhealthy approach to the Bible. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, as you've described, many people will describe coming into premillennial thought or maybe even dispensational thought as almost a conversion experience. It's such a radically transformative experience for some people that to have that challenged, or maybe if you grow up within it, it almost feels as if the earth is shaking. Like you brought up just a second ago, somebody mentioning that, they didn't know anything else was out there. I think for most of us in pastoral ministry, that occurs frequently when someone will say, you're applying that passage in a way I've never heard that before. And that could be kind of a ground shifting thing. I would think a historical approach could help with that.
Yeah, definitely. And if nothing else, you can see how these things have happened over time. So I think of there's a part of the book where I talk about this conference in 1914. It's a premillennial conference right at the cusp of World War I. And they have a panel at the conference. This is at Dwight Moody's church in Chicago. It's a really big deal. And they have a whole panel, and the panel is called "Why I Became a Premillennialist." And the panel is full of these luminaries from the sort of Dwight Moody world, who all have very particular stories about how they came to a premillennialist view of eschatology. And the stories are very moving. Some of them can cite like the exact day that this happened.
Wow.
Others can just remember the book they were reading. Many of them cite something like a book by Schofield or James Brooks, who was an earlier popular writer. And you really get a sense that for that generation, premillennialism is really making sense of things, of things that they were trying to make sense of. And premillennialism sort of comes along, they discover it, and it seems to put into place some issues around biblical authority, some issues around what's happening in the world, some issues around the priority of global missions. And these are all things that are, to me as a historian, signs of a growing and sort of there's a lot of momentum behind the movement. And I take them all to be really authentic. I don't think these are people who are searching as desperately as any of us for sort of the biblical truth, and this is what they came to. You don't hear, and I'm sure there are stories like that today, of people continuing to discover dispensationalism in that way. But the trend, and you can think of those people in 1914, many of them were converting out of or were dropping a post-millennial system. That's what had been the dominant view of most American Protestants in the 19th century. And so many of them who were born in that century grew up in a world that assumed that, much like people in the 50s, 60s, 70s grew up in a world that assumed premillennialism. But today, I think it's almost reversed, and that's what sort of history can do, is just show you these bigger trends. And that when I'm reading around and trying to understand sort of where is the bigger shift happening, there's a lot more people that have stories of sort of dropping premillennialism and picking up something else, whether it's a postmillennialism or an amillennialism, or there's obviously a lot of sub schools in those as well.
Right, yeah.
But that seems to be the shift now, and I find it interesting as a historian, but also indicative of sort of broader trends in American society, in the church, where the scholarship is at. That make me sort of interested in those stories of people talking about, people like on your show, talking about how they grew up in that world and then encountered a certain thinker or encountered a certain problem, intellectual problem, that led them to rethink that.
Yeah. So, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. I'm thinking through some of the issues that have been popping up since we spoke last. Christian Twitter has been trying to solve the entire Christian nationalism debate, issues of
Mm.
theonomy, church-state relations, all these things that are of national significance, that Christians are thinking through a lot right now. Here's my lead-in question, Daniel, and help me walk through this. But I'm thinking toward your work. You kind of outline three main phases of dispensational thought, if I'm recalling
Yeah.
correctly, and correct me here if I'm wrong. But 1830 to 1900, 1900 to 1960, and then you kind of focus in on the fall period, as you define the fall, 1960s onward into today, and that's really an intriguing part of that work for me. But looking at those things, and I want to look toward how you suss out dispensational thought shaping our nation. And obviously that's probably a theme that could run across your whole book. But what are some specific examples you might give? And really, if you've got any that are in the area of what you were just addressing, with current scholarship reflecting less premillennialism, maybe more amillennialism, postmillennialism, do you see any connections there? Walk us into that a little bit.
Yeah. And yeah, some of these things do connect to sort of the Christian Twitter stuff, and some are more just sort of academic trends. But you definitely see by the 1970s a pretty strong shift in the broader, if you want to call it, the evangelical seminary world, the sort of theologians and professors who are writing about eschatology and biblical studies, and theology generally, a shift against dispensationalism. And there'd always been a pretty robust resistance to dispensationalism in the sort of covenantalist reformed tradition. But by the 1970s, it's becoming much broader than that. And in fact, a number of people who grew up and were trained as dispensationalists are starting to sort of turn against that tradition. And one really prime example would be someone like Bruce Waltke, the Old Testament scholar who basically becomes quite reformed. But he was trained at Dallas Seminary, and he actually taught there early in his career. And so by the 1970s, there's a shift happening, and really by the 1990s, there's what's often referred to as sort of an evangelical consensus on a lot of these issues that really lands where the New Testament scholar George Ellen Ladd led a lot of his scholarship in the 60s and 70s, which was an already not yet paradigm for the kingdom, and a way to talk that would allow historic premillennialists and amillennialists, and maybe some light postmillennialists as well, to all sort of talk to each other and not debate some of the fundamentals. And that's where a lot of the literature now, I guess you'd say, lands, is in that sort of consensus school. And that would include progressive dispensationalism, at least in my reading, which emerges in the 1980s as a response to some of these critiques and really tries to find common ground with historic premillennialists and amillennialists, where the sort of dispensationalists can also discuss things. And so people like Darrell Bock down at Dallas led that charge, the progressive dispensational movement in the late 80s, mid 90s. So that's where a lot of the seminary conversation is happening. And so one reason why, like, the Christian nationalist conversation, well, it's just different people having those conversations, but many of those Christian nationalist writers or people who are sort of weighing in on that don't necessarily buy into that consensus school that places like Fuller and Gordon Conwell and Trinity and some of these sort of mainstream evangelical seminaries, they might not buy into that consensus school. And so they're coming at some of the questions around what is the kingdom, what is the role of the church in relation to the kingdom. They're coming around those issues from different perspectives, which are leading to different arguments across the board.
Okay, no, that's helpful. So kind of the already not yet paradigm, because that's become pretty widespread in most eschatological literature, I would think. You
That's
see
right.
that kind of a pan eschatological category then?
Yeah, that's where the broadly sort of conservative Protestant theological world has landed. Now, if you rewind 60, 70 years, that would have been a pretty remarkable outcome. That was not there were much harder lines drawn in the sort of 1950s, 1960s, because there were these broader systematic theologies that saw a lot at stake based on how you viewed the kingdom and whether it was already here, whether it was fully here, whether it was not here at all yet, all those different positions. That's one of the sort of interesting, more historical trajectory things that I think historians can show, because often we, like I said before, we enter into these conversations at a certain point in time, and we just sort of take for granted where the conversation was at when we entered it and sort of assume that's how it's been, I don't know, since time immemorial, or at least
Right.
since recent history. But if you sort of zoom back, you realize that sort of general, already not yet consensus is not that new. At least it's not new in the way that everyone's referencing it as the point of agreement across the board.
Okay. So looking back to like national implications then of dispensationalism, how it's framed our nation, and obviously that's a huge chunk of your work. If someone was to have asked me, guy on the street asks me, hey, how do you think dispensationalism has framed our national consciousness? As a layman, I probably would have pointed to maybe the relationship with Israel,
Yeah,
political ties with the nation state of Israel, which you've done. You've done some of your work studying in Israel, if I'm remembering correctly.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah. So would that be
yeah.
one of the, I mean, is that one of the major points, or are there other points that maybe eclipse the US/Israel political relations? Like how has this kind of shaped the national, the national mindset, even maybe beyond church spheres?
Yeah, I'll mention two, and then a third broader one. One is evangelical support for Israel. If you just go historically, the evangelicals who are very interested in that issue not Israel's founded in 1948 as a state. The evangelicals who before 1948 were advocating for the Zionist movement, or after were supporting the state of Israel, tended to come out of dispensationalist backgrounds, and they tended to cite their view of the role Israel would play in God's sort of plans as one reason why they were supporting Israel. So you see a pretty clear link there. Today, it's a little more messy on that. There's a lot of other arguments, theological, biblical arguments that Christian Zionists make for supporting Israel that don't necessarily relate to dispensationalism. They relate to arguments in the Pentecostal world and other things as well. But historically, there's a clear linkage. And if you even think about really sort of big political names like Jerry Falwell or someone,
Right.
he came out of a dispensationalist background and made a very strong case for supporting Israel based on that. A second issue is a young earth creationism. So to those of your viewers who subscribe to that view, that was a view that was not held. So young earth creationism being the idea that the earth was created within the last 10,000 or so years, that you're reading Genesis 1 through 3, very literally. You're taking those 6 days of creation as literal days of creation. All of the sort of leaders in the 1920s, when we start talking about the fundamentalist movement, almost none of them were young earth creationists. They were what were called old earth creationists, and many of them subscribed to something called the gap theory, which is not really talked about anymore, which is that there's a major gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:3 that could account for fossils and other things on the earth. Since then, up until today, young earth creationism has been a very popular view among many Christians, and has produced its own little subculture of textbooks and literature, and then also has led to a lot of debates about public schools and all that kind of stuff. Many of the people who really promoted that idea starting in the 1920s and going forward were dispensationalists, and they did it for a variety of reasons, because they opposed evolution as a theory, and they saw sort of the old dating of the earth as part of evolution, but they also were the people who were staking out sort of the most literal readings of scripture are going to come from the dispensationalists. And so they saw a literal reading of Genesis 1 as really in line with the rest of their hermeneutic. And so we're willing to really stake their reputation on that. So by the 1960s, when young earth creation becomes popular, places like Dallas Seminary are really at the forefront of promoting it.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Daniel. Just to push in on that though. So would you say then that 1920s, and again we're thinking that would be during your kind of second phase of dispensationalism, right? So 1920s, are people adopting that because of their dispensational? I know some people would quibble with whether or not dispensationals have a hermeneutic or whether they employ a hermeneutic. Which chicken before the egg type thing right there. But are they adopting it because of the hermeneutic that they're employing, or is it just because they're the popular voices within conservative circles that they happen to be taking that view on? Like, which one leads to the other?
Yeah, I think you can get examples of both. So
Okay.
there are some people who there are particular leaders, people like William Bell Riley, who was a major anti-evolution activist in the 1920s, He is a dispensationalist by theology and sees a literal reading of Genesis 1 as sort of crucial to his the way he understands the Bible. So he is adopting young earth creationism sort of because of that reason, though he's not only citing that reason. He's also trying to make broader cultural arguments about the need for sort of biblical authority to be at the center of American life, and that if you're an evolutionist, you can't really believe in biblical authority. He's making all those arguments, but he sees it. He sees the hermeneutical stakes as very high. There are, of course, other people who are adopting young earth creationism because it's becoming the dominant view among the leadership, whether they're dispensationalist or not. And after some point, it's sort of all these things get merged together into a sort of bigger sort of cultural matrix of where young earth creationism is sort of tied into other views. And so they all sort of rise or fall together. And
Okay.
by the 60s, you have the books by Henry Morris and others that really promote young earth creationism and sort of trying to date the flood and all that kind of stuff. By then, it's a pretty well set view that is not only unique to dispensationalists. It's held by a lot of different Christians, but some of the early champions of it did champion it because they saw it as so consistent with the rest of their hermeneutic.
Okay, no, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And were you honing in on a third point there a second ago when we were talking about those national?
Yeah, so we talked about Israel and then sort of young earth creationism.
There we
The
go.
broader sort of bigger way that dispensationalism has shaped broader American politics and culture is so many of the early Christian right leaders. So if we talk about the Christian right as sort of that organized movement of conservative Christians in the 70s and into the 80s, who really sort of organized to vote for their values in both state and national politics. Many of those leaders who sort of founded that movement were dispensationalists. So I mentioned Jerry Falwell, Tim LaHaye, who of course co-wrote the Left Behind books, was a very committed dispensationalist. Many people sort of below them that were less famous but also very important to the movement were dispensationalists as well, and they came to their politics, or they came to their feeling that they needed to engage in politics. Both LaHaye and Falwell were pastors, so this is a big change for them, moving from pastoring a community to basically getting into political organizing. But they believed that what was at stake in the 70s was the global missions movement, and the movement that was really headquartered in the US, that was, in their view, threatened by secular humanists and communists and others who they saw as infiltrating all parts of American society. And so they framed what they were doing, and they tried to convince their congregants and their followers to get active in voting and other political activism, to basically save the church in the US. And they saw this as saving the church so it could do the work it needed to do before the rapture. And so there's ways that we talk about the rise of the Christian right using particular social issues like abortion or feminism or something, and sort of Christians reacted to those. And I think those are fine, but those only tell half the story. There's also this whole sort of internal theological and even pastoral argument for why Christians need to get off their behinds and sort of start voting and other things that really have to do with their theological systems as well. And you see a lot of people debating this in the 80s. You see sort of post-millennialists wondering if premillennialists are really going to stick with it, since their eschatology doesn't seem like it lends itself to long-term political action. And you have premillennialists saying, well, we need to do as much as we can before the rapture, in order to sort of continue the missions movement. So those become really interesting debates in the 80s.
Yeah, and that seems to be a debate. I mean, I would say that's a debate currently between most of the post-mill and pre-mill camps. Maybe not a debate, but maybe a point of eschatological, at least, interest, that you have. On the one hand, you have a group that says Christ's return should be imminent and unexpected, and probably, maybe within the next couple of years, and yet they're working as if Christ may not come for several hundred years. A little interaction there between the two. I've seen a lot of really interesting interactions on that count recently.
Yeah, and I mean, this was a point of discussion within dispensationalist camps too. So once politics became one of the things that was seen as worth investing in, they'd often have sayings like, live as if Christ is coming today, but plan as if he's not, basically. Right. And I don't see that as too self-contradictory. I think we all, have different sort of planning horizons. And I think what they were probably saying too is there's so much within the dispensationalist world of that imminency really playing into personal piety, playing into urgency for missions and other things. And I think what dispensationalists were expressing at that time was don't lose those things that we've really built around. They would often call the rapture the blessed hope. They still do, as sort of this is the thing that we put our hope in. And so don't get rid of that, even though we are acting in political, and of course most people are buying houses and investing and planning for their kids' future and things that you wouldn't do if you sort of were entirely committed to just thinking about tomorrow, and Jesus might come tomorrow.
Right.
So they're trying to think through those things as well. But I think the critique of that would be this ultimately is pretty inconsistent, and you're going to have to start compartmentalizing different theological arguments and then different sort of political arguments. Whereas other schools, and I think of sort of the Reconstructionists coming out of the 1980s, hit the dispensationalists pretty hard on this, that they saw their system, the sort of the post-millennial response, as much more consistent, because you're sort of working for these long-term gains in society in a way that didn't seem to make sense to them for why dispensationalists would be doing the same type of work.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. So one of the best things about your book now being in print, and it's on the shelf now, is that now we can fault you for the things you didn't include in the book,
Sure.
right? No,
That's right.
Word counts and editors and publishers aside, though, I'm sure you've already encountered, because I feel like every author does this, the day after it's printed, you think of something that you would have changed or would have included. Anything you would include in a second volume, second edition down the road, anything that you're seeing, that would have been a great chapter, maybe, or an appendix on the end or anything like that that's popped out from the book. I know we had a mutual friend that asked me, and I'm compelled to ask you the question, maybe any dispensational scholars that did not make it into your book that maybe you would have addressed any of those sort of issues.
Historically, so there's a few ways to answer that. Of course, every author, it's sort of like painful to finish a book because you can't change anything else on it, right? And particularly, I'm not going to make this an excuse, but there's been a paper shortage for anyone who's an author out there. So I actually finished this book over a year ago. Like, it was sitting for about 8 months with nothing to do, because the publisher just needed time to catch up on the backlog of books publishing, because there's a paper shortage. So there's even a longer time where you're sort of learning new things, rethinking things, and going, oh, I wish I could just have one more pass at the whole book.
Sure.
But we can't, and I'm willing to live with that. But in terms of historically, are there any dispensationalist scholars I wish I could have talked about? There are so many. There's so many sort of sub stories. One that I wish I could have talked more about, he only gets a few paragraphs really, is a guy named Alva McLean, who lived in the mid 20th century, who wrote a massive book on the kingdom of God in 1959 that I thought was actually a very interesting book. And he's anticipating, he's at Grace Theological Seminary, by the way, which is one of the key dispensational seminaries at that time. He's anticipating a lot of the shifts, this is how I read him, a lot of the shifts that happen in progressive dispensationalism 30 years later. And he's anticipating them in the late 50s. And I find that to be really interesting. He's sort of identifying some problems with the system as it was handed to him. And unfortunately, he died. That was going to be part one of like a 7-part massive series. He died just a few years later, and so he didn't finish it. But he's someone I wish I would have just had the space to spend more time on his thought and what he was anticipating in the system. In terms of people today, so I made a choice that I wish. If I could write a second volume, maybe I'd add a chapter. I don't know if there's enough there for a chapter, but I'd at least add a few paragraphs on the very contemporary sort of, since 2010 type conversation between the different schools that I'm tracking. So between the dispensationalist scholars, between the more reformed amillennialist scholars, and then the post-millennialist. And then there's even a fourth group, which doesn't have a big scholarly conversation, but is very important, which are sort of the Pentecostal post-millennialist types that have gotten a lot of play in the news and stuff because some of them are very politically active and influential, and they have mega churches and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yep.
I don't really talk about them much at all in the book, but I would love to have added another section maybe to the final chapter on the more theological story to describe the different sort of scholarly conversations happening. One reason I didn't is because and I'm really happy to be corrected on this. So please, if listeners, reach out to me if you have things for me to read. But I just haven't seen a ton of movement in the sort of basic arguments between these camps since really the 1990s. I mean, there's new scholarship happening and new ways of framing the debates, but I didn't detect sort of a big shift since the introduction of progressive dispensationalism in the 90s. And the introduction of Reconstructionism and sort of that whole school that I still, think we're a lot of those people are still with us and are writing and everything. That there hasn't been like a big seismic shift yet, and so I didn't sort of want to just add in names and other things just for the sake of checking the names. But I've been talking to a few people who are much more invested in that scholarly conversation. And they're disappointed that they're not in the book, or that their particular network of scholars is not in the book. So, in addition to, I'd love to sort of flesh that out a little more than it is already.
Okay, so kind of contemporary scholarship. That's interesting that you didn't peg, because in the 90s though, you do see the progressive dispensational camp, and that really shakes up the conversation, even from what I've seen. Looking in. Any other appendices or anything that you would add onto the book that have stuck out so far?
Yeah, one, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this, but one thing that is, if you're ever doing historical work, that is just notoriously hard to find are book sales. No one has to publish book sales. So the only people who do are ones that want to brag about it, basically. Like, you don't publish book sales of the publisher. It's entirely up to the publisher. And so it's not even really dependable numbers necessarily. I mean, you're sort of trusting that publishers aren't going to just say wildly inaccurate numbers. But I would love to have an appendix that tracked sort of the top, I don't know, I'd find like the top 30 best-selling books that are from a dispensationalist perspective or something, and see when they sold and how much they sold. I sort of track throughout the book one-offs, everything from Jesus is Coming, which was a bestseller back in the 1870s, up to the Left Behind novels and other things. But people like Hal Lindsey, who published The Late Great Planet Earth and many other bestsellers, he published a ton of books, and you read these articles that say, each of these books is a million seller. And I was never able to find like sort of real evidence of that, besides, the magazine coverage of it or whatever. And I would love, I wish there was some like centralized database where it's sort of like, I wish it was like movie sales, where the box office, you can sort of look up what's the best-selling movie of all time or whatever. And there's just nothing like that for books. It's way more decentralized. And so when you're making arguments about cultural influence based on book sales, you're sort of treading in choppy waters about sort of, what can I claim? Am I just sort of citing this number because it feels good? You ask that question as a historian because it's sort of making my argument for me.
Right. Can
I find more than one person saying this book has sold X number of copies? Anyway, that's one of the appendices I'd love. I think it requires access that I will never get, nor anyone will ever get, to the real numbers on these things. But it's always of interest to me, sort of how much these books in particular sort of circulate and really do shape the culture that most Christians grow up in. And many more people are reading Hal Lindsey's books than are reading the more careful theological treatises by dispensational scholars, and that's a really important sort of story to tell.
And that's to say, well, number one, that would be fascinating. Number two, and this is even more impossible than what you're proposing, would be to track the secondhand book sales, because anybody that's been into a used bookstore, there's certain books, and I won't name them, but they seem to get recirculated at every used bookstore I've been to. Daniel, I want to be respectful of your time, brother. The book again, The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism: How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped a Nation. It's out through Eerdmans. Daniel, where can people follow you? Where are you active? Are you on Twitter, on that online boxing match of Twitter, or where are you at, brother?
I am. It's not my favorite place, but I do like interacting with people in positive interactions on there. So at Daniel G. Hummel, DanielGHummel.com is where I sort of house all my stuff. And And then here at Upper House, I host our podcast. We have a new podcast called With Faith in Mind that looks at Christian education today. I have a lot of stuff, so you can check out upperhouse.org as well for stuff we're doing here in Madison, Wisconsin.
Perfect. Well, Daniel, thanks so much again for chatting. It's always a pleasure. And Daniel Hummel, appreciate your time, brother.
A pleasure. Thanks for talking.
Seated here at my right hand.